There you go.
How now?
Yes, I can.
Well,
oh, yeah, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for burning the candle at both ends with us, regardless of which extreme side of the Pacific that you find yourself on today. It is my pleasure to join PICES. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jessica Cross, and I'm a researcher at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, and I'm based here in Seattle, Washington. And carbonate chemistry is my bread and butter, and I do most of my work in the coastal oceans around Alaska. Today, I'm sitting in Seattle, as I mentioned earlier, and I want to thank the organizers of PICES, as well as the traditional inhabitants of Seattle, the Duwamish people, for the opportunity to speak with you today. So in this talk, I hope to give you some context about the last decade of ocean acidification science in the Bering Sea and how it's led to some recent work with a regional model that's helping us understand ocean acidification extreme events in the Bering Sea, and then some ideas for where I think the next decade might be leading us. So for those of you that may be new to ocean acidification as a type of extreme event, I think it's unlikely in this particular room, but just in case, here are the basics. As we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from various sources, the oceans soak it up. And when this happens in areas that already have a naturally very high concentration of carbon dioxide, like the waters around Alaska, a cascade of chemical reactions can create pH conditions that are corrosive enough to dissolve calcium carbonates. And these are what we otherwise call ocean acidification events. The picture here in the lower right is from Whale Fest in 2011, where a group of fishing boats arranged themselves to spell out acid ocean in the O of SOS. And you can see I've applied events there because it's slightly more accurate, even though hard to spell with boats. Ocean acidification can have a variety of complex and nuanced impacts on marine biota. Directly, it can reduce the growth and survival of juvenile fish and shellfish. And indirectly, ocean acidification can reduce the abundance of prey for commercially lucrative populations, like the ones we're really concerned with here at PICES. And it can also impact sensory functions for some fishes. Over time, the cumulative effects of these stresses may reduce the productivity of commercial and subsistence fish stocks. Just considering red king crab, extensive laboratory studies and modeling efforts have shown that there could be a 50% decrease in catch and profits in the coming decades, amounting to as much as $1 billion welfare loss to Alaskan households. I want to take a step back for a minute and note that the crash that we are exploring in the Bering Sea right now for several species of crab, we don't think ocean acidification is related to this year's crash, but it might influence another crash in the future. So this work on understanding the environmental and biological hazards of ocean acidification research led to the development of an OA index, OA risk index, showing that some communities in southeastern and southwestern Alaska may be most vulnerable to ocean acidification. You can see them highlighted in red in this particular map. And that's usually based on the limited economic diversity and strained food security that these areas already experience. And all this leads to the number one question that I am asked anytime I'm interacting with local Alaskans, which is, what do we do about this? How can we help understand these extreme events and respond to them? People really want to know what they can do to adapt or mitigate these kinds of risks, but often these place-based strategies require high-resolution, place-based knowledge. Think of the community sampling plan we saw outlined in the last talk. So in order to make a response plan, communities and industries need to know exactly what their local scale risk is. And our group has spent the last 5 years responding to that call for high resolution, localized information in one of the most expansive coastal areas in the United States. There's more coastline in Alaska than the East Coast, the West Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Great Lakes combined, which is a lot of territory for us to try to cover in this context. Regional models are outstanding tools for generating these high resolution maps like the one I'm showing here. Without models, we are restricted to providing information at the triangles, the black dots, and the gray track lines that you can otherwise see in this map. Obviously, the shading in the background, the model output provides a lot more detailed information. And so while models can't provide very good estimates at the immediate near shore yet, that's why community sampling programs are so valuable. These regional models do help us estimate regional and sub-regional ocean acidification exposure. So for example, global models like the one I'm showing in this particular diagram have approximately 11 grid cell points in Bristol Bay, but our regional model shows many, many more. So even though we're not quite at the backyard level yet, these regional models are really helpful tools for us to be able to understand ocean acidification processes and relate those to community governance. Previous work has developed a biophysical regional model for the Bering Sea that's been adopted by managers and stakeholders and is already used in management practices and for understanding ecosystem trends. So we're just piggybacking off of that effort by adding a carbonate chemistry package to that model. So before we can advocate that the carbonate chemistry package should also be adopted by fisheries managers and regional adaptation plans, we work really hard to build trust in the model output. Model validation is a nuanced effort that is really important for our colleagues, like many of you on the phone, but given the short time I have to talk to you today, I'll try to sum it up here in a single figure. What I'm showing in this map is a comparison between discrete seawater samples, which you see in the small circles, and the model data shown as shading in the back along a cross-shelf transect, which is highlighted in yellow in the inset. As you can see, the model captures the same qualitative patterns that we expect, generally warm colors with warm colors and cool colors with cool colors. And if you're a modeling expert and you'd like to delve more into the structure and function of this particular regional model, I really encourage you to get in touch with Darren Pilcher at the University of Washington, who is the expert behind this work and is really supporting a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you today. So let's take a look at some of the model output. I've sort of argued with you that these are great tools. What are they teaching us? Here we've chosen to highlight summertime bottom waters, and this is in a time period and area that could be especially important for some fisheries and which was identified and requested by our colleagues in fisheries management. So we're really taking guidance from them on the outputs that we're sharing. So against the long-term average shown at the top, where warm colors indicate more corrosive waters, outer shelf waters in 2020, shown in the bottom panel, were more corrosive than usual. And that could be especially important. So remember that projected 50% decline in Bristol Bay red king crab that's not the culprit of this year's crash, but could be important in the future. This could contribute, this kind of event could contribute to that vulnerability. Even though it's not quite severe enough to cause that kind of a crash yet. But we are noticing that this event has the same anomaly has showed up again in 2021. This year, the anomaly has weakened somewhat. So you can see the difference between the 2020 anomaly and the 2021 anomaly shown in these two panels. And this also gave us the opportunity to test some of our hypotheses about what might be causing this anomaly over the outer shelf to show up. Right now, we think it's related to winds that may favor topographic upwelling of deep CO2-rich water to the outer shelf. But because the Bering Sea shelf is so wide, it is physically unlikely that these mechanisms would move past the central front, sort of where you see it capped off in these plots. We are keeping an eye on the model results, and we hope to collect some validation samples in future years when we get back out into the field after COVID. We've also been asked by our colleagues in fisheries management to highlight long-term trends for the entire Bering Sea and a few sub-regional areas. Here I'm showing so while these are just test metrics for now, we continue to receive feedback throughout the management process. That process in the United States is shown here in the lower right. That's going to help us further refine these metrics. Ideally, these teams have asked us for seasonal forecasts of corrosivity for the coming year. And we had planned to test a seasonal forecast in 2020, but unfortunately, we will not able to collect this data due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're scheduled to try and complete this again in 2022, pandemic permitting. We also hope to release an analysis of long-term projection across the next 100 years, and I'll show you some of those preliminary results right now. Remember that what we really wanted to do with this model was get a closer look at regional vulnerability as cost effectively as we can. So what I'm showing on this plot is a projection of bottom water acidified conditions under 2 emission scenarios. RCP 8.5, which is our business as usual scenario for emissions, and RCP 4.5 on the right, which is a more restrained emission scenario where we behave more responsibly, particularly poignant as we head into COP in the coming weeks. The 3 different colors shown in these graphs correspond to 3 different OA thresholds that have been identified by Chris Long as important for the regional ecosystem. That's also why we're looking at bottom waters, again, important ecosystem where crab live in these particular plots. And then the first thing I want to note is that the beginning of the graph for both scenarios looks almost the same. And this is because ocean acidification is a slow process. So the amount of carbon dioxide we've already released into the atmosphere locks in a certain amount of impact. It's the later years that are more important and where the graphs diverge a little bit. Effectively, by reducing our emissions to the RCP 4.5 level, we may be able to save 30% or so of the growing season for crab, while the business as usual scenario means that we will probably lose all of that ideal habitat at the 7.8 pH threshold by somewhere towards the end of the century. So again, the power of a regional model is that we can take a closer look than just the entire shelf. So here's the exact same notes for just Bristol Bay. Again, the beginning of the plots looks almost the same, but it's the end of the time series that we can avoid by adhering to this RCP 4.5 emissions scenario. So what has to change in order to build ocean acidification resilience? In part, this is a global problem that requires global solutions, just like any climate change problem. And a lot of work has been done by the international community to estimate how we might be able to avoid the RCP 8.5 scenario. Here's a plot that sums up a lot of that work. Time is shown on the x-axis with annual global emissions on the y-axis. The yellow line shows the total amount of total greenhouse gas emissions in a business as usual scenario. And then the red line shows the maximum amount of emissions possible to avoid 2 degrees Celsius of warming. It's not exactly the same as the RCP 8.5 and 4.5 scenarios I showed on the last slide, but it's essentially the same principle. The color shading in the back shows how we might be able to change our energy strategy to pull that yellow line down to that red line. Effectively, we have to shift to renewable energy for the vast majority of our energy needs, replacing a lot of emissions, and that chunk here is shown in green. However, the IPCC acknowledges that it's going to be very hard to replace some emissions, like diesel fuel for ships, for example, which we all rely on. Those stubborn emissions are shown here in brown. However, this SR 1.5 acknowledged for the first time that we're going to need the blue section here, otherwise known as negative emissions technologies, to stay below this 2 degrees Celsius temperature threshold by 2100. I want to take a moment to emphasize here that the green area is a lot bigger than the blue area. It's going to be very, very difficult technologically for us to achieve the blue area at all. So in the meantime, we have to use established technologies to reduce our emissions as much as we can while we're trying to scale up carbon removal technologies to meet these blue area targets. So given how reliant we're coming to be on that blue area, on this concept of negative emissions, I imagine that in the community, we're going to hear a lot about carbon dioxide removal, which is a subset of negative emissions technologies that focuses on using natural means to pull carbon from the atmosphere. One side benefit of these methods is that they may also mitigate ocean acidification, at least over very short time and space scales. So in Alaska, there's a lot of interest in kelp farming right now. First, macroalgal crops could have their own value. Globally, seaweed crops are valued at about $10 billion a year. And Japan's nori production amounts to $2 billion annually, and it's one of the world's most valuable crops. So globally, macroalgal cultivation is expanding at 7% annually. And since Alaska granted its first permits, its growth rate in this industry has already surpassed Maine, which is the other biggest producer of kelp in the United States. So as we co-develop macroalgal farming with commercial interests, it will be essential to learn from and respect coastal traditions and maintain sustainability as much as we can. Some Alaskan indigenous groups are already working with Greenwave and the Nature Conservancy to develop an Indigenous Kelp Farmers Bill of Rights. And as initial research is conducted, industry tribes and research partners are already working together on case studies in Maine, Washington, and Alaska. So in the meantime, we're already starting to use computational tools like those that we've developed here and I've highlighted for you today to explore other mechanisms of carbon removal. For example, one technique adds alkalinity to the surface ocean that can help capture atmospheric carbon dioxide. Again, the side benefit being that it may also help mitigate ocean acidification. You may notice here that a point source addition of alkalinity modeled in Unimac Pass would impact surface waters over the outer shelf. So while this won't exactly help the anomalously acidic bottom waters in the outer shelf area that I discussed earlier, it could be an interesting natural laboratory to study how these phenomena may relate to each other. Again, I'll emphasize that this is very early research, that we are just starting to scale using some of these hypothetical tools, and we are nowhere near implementing any of these solutions or ideas in the field. I am very lucky to work with a great team of cross-disciplinary researchers in the Alaskan community that help me and the rest of us explore the impact of ocean acidification, again, in this multidisciplinary context. I want to thank the broader scientific community that talks through big ideas like these at conferences exactly like this one, and for the support of local communities that help us find new concepts to explore. Honestly, Alaskan fishermen are the ones that made me take a second closer look at CDR when I might have written it off entirely from the very beginning. So Koyana, and thanks everybody for listening. If there's time for questions, I'd be happy to oblige.